Hello everyone, and welcome to another D&T graphics lesson. Today's lesson we are going to be focusing on shading to make a 3D line drawing look like a solid object. For our first example, we are going to be shading this line drawing of a cube, and to help us, we have a reference image on the left. We also have a light source, this image of a sun over here, which shows us where the light hitting our object is coming from. The first side of our cube which hits the light first is the lightest. The side away from the light is slightly darker, however the base, which has no light hitting it, is the darkest. Now to shade our line drawing, I will be using a pencil color. However, you could use any medium which you like, but I would avoid markers at this stage if you're not that confident in your drawing. Now let's start. Now to prevent myself from drawing outside of the lines while shading, I'm going to draw a very faint border around the edges of our solid block. I'm going to draw this border as faint as possible so it will not affect my final drawing. Now to show that our cube has flat sides, it is important that our strokes must not be in all directions. However, they must be in one direction. They could be either vertically upwards or downwards, or horizontally according to the angle of our 3D shape. I am going to draw vertically in this case. You could use the one-stroke method, or you could draw back and forth. Now remember, this side is going to be the lightest because light is hitting this side first. Now let's speed things up a little bit so this won't be a long video. However, remember to take your time while shading. We want our final drawing to be as neat as possible, and remember to not leave any areas left blank. Okay, now on to the other side. Now this side is facing away from the light, so it's going to be slightly darker. So what I'm going to do first is draw a light layer and then build another layer on top of it. Okay, I finished my first layer, now on to the second layer. I'm making this side darker by building up color. By using this method, you will be preventing yourself from pressing too hard on the surface of the paper, which will result in a large buildup of color which will be too hard to go over again. Now I'm going to speed things up a little bit. However, remember to take your time while shading. You want your drawing to be as realistic and neat as possible. Now onto the base of our cube. Remember that we build darkness by drawing one layer on top of another. Also remember to keep your strokes while drawing in one direction. Now unfortunately, this is as dark as I could go with this color. And to make it more similar to the image which I have on the left, I'm going to draw another layer with using light strokes with this orange. You don't have to press super hard on the paper to make it darker. Always draw with a sharpened pencil lead, and keep your strokes as light as possible. To make it darker, you could always go over it with another layer of orange in this case. In the next example, we're going to draw the shading of a cuboid. I'm going to use the same method as before. However, I'm going to use the same color throughout. Now let's start by shading the lightest side first, the side which hits the light first. Keep your strokes in one direction, as this is a flat side. You could also draw back and forth. However, you have to keep them in one direction, back and forth. Like for example, don't switch from vertical to horizontal while drawing. Otherwise, you won't end up with a neat drawing or a realistic sketch. Now let's even out the color so we won't end up with patches which are darker or lighter. We must keep our color even throughout the side of our solid shape. Then when finished, we will move on to the other side, which is placed away from the light. Therefore, this side has to be darker than the one we did before. Again, I'm going to start with a light layer and then I'll build up color by drawing another layer on top of the previous. Now let's draw the second layer. Now onto the base of our cuboid. In the next example, we have a square pyramid. Now this solid block differs from the others as the sides of the square pyramid meet at an apex. Even though the sides are flat, we still have to make an effort and show that these sides are standing diagonally to the base of the pyramid. Now let's start by shading the lightest side of our square pyramid, the side which hits the light first. Now to show that this is a triangular side, we have to start our strokes starting from the base and meeting the apex at the top. As you can see, all strokes are at a different angle as long as they meet the top apex. For the next side, you'll use the same method. However, this time this side is going to be darker than the lightest side. And we could shade our base by using just straight strokes, since it is a square flat base. The next example, we have to do the shading of a cone. Now, what makes this shape different from the other solid shapes is because of the curved side that meets at an apex. Okay, let's start with this side then. Now let's start. Now to prevent myself from drawing outside of the lines, I'm going to draw that faint border line around the outlines of my cone. I'm also going to draw this border on the circular base of our cone. However, for now I'm going to avoid drawing this border on the lightest side of our cone. Now, of course, this time, since we are drawing a curved side, our strokes have to be curved as well, following the shape of the cone. Now, if you are a beginner in drawing in general, I suggest that first you would start with a light layer and then go over the areas which have to be darker with a second layer. Now let's go over this side with a second layer, as this side is placed away from the light. Now let's continue with the base of our cone. Again, the base of our cone is a flat surface, therefore our strokes have to be in one direction, one straight direction. Could be either back and forth, or you could also use the one-stroke method. In the next example, we have a line drawing of a circle, and with our shading, we have to make it look like a solid sphere. And we have a reference image on the left. And as you can see, the light is hitting this side of our sphere. The rest is going to be dark. Now let's start. Now, since this is a trickier object to shade, I'm going to again draw that faint negligible light outline around the border of our circle to help me not draw outside the lines. Now, since this is a curved object, our strokes, just like the cone, have to be curved. You have to let the outlines and shape of the sphere guide you in this case. So let's start. If you're not confident in drawing, always start with small strokes as I'm doing here. No need to do long strokes. It's better to shade little by little and then even out the color later. And as we did before, it's always ideal to start with a light layer, a light first layer, and then go over the other areas which need to be darker with a second layer, or even third or fourth. Now, when approaching the lightest part of our sphere, make sure that your strokes are going to be even lighter, like you're barely touching the paper. Now let's go over this side again with another second layer, since this is being barely hit by the light. Again, when approaching the lightest part of your sphere, make sure that your strokes are going to get lighter. You're going to start from darkest to lightest. Now here we have something similar, however this time we have a hemisphere. We're going to use the same method as the previous one to draw the curved part of our hemisphere, and the flat base we're going to just use again flat strokes. Now I'm going to start with the base, however to stop myself from drawing outside the lines again, I'm going to draw that faint border line around the outlines of my hemisphere. Let's speed things up a little bit. You probably know the method by now. Just keep straight strokes in one direction or one direction back and forth. And again, start with a light layer and then go over it with a second layer, as this is going to be the darkest side of our hemisphere. Now onto the spherical side of our hemisphere. Now to show that this is a spherical object, our strokes have to be curved again once more, and again from darkest to lightest. However, if you're a beginner, always start with a light layer before and then go over the areas which have to be darker with a second layer. Same as we did with the sphere before, when drawing the lightest side, your strokes have to be very, very, very light, like you're barely touching the paper. And let's go over this side, which is placed away from the light, therefore it's going to be darker. Let's give it a second or maybe even a third layer. Let's speed things up a little bit. Remember to take your time when shading. We want our final drawing to be as neat as possible. In the next example, we have a cylinder. Now notice that in the reference image, the light is hitting the shape on this side. And since this is a curved object, we have a curved side, our strokes have to be curved as well. However, on the flat base, again, as we do always, we just use straight strokes to represent that our base is flat. Now let's start. And to prevent myself from drawing outside of the outlines, I'm going to be drawing that border line around the outlines of my cylinder. I'm going to do the same on the curved edges. Now each stroke, as you're shading, make sure that you start from darkest to lightest and stop at the area where light hits the cylinder. Up till now, to show that our solid shape is curved, I'm using the one-stroke method. Do the same on the other side. Now unfortunately, the strokes are not as curved as I want them to be, so to draw more comfortably, I'm going to rotate my textbook and continue from there, as I'm drawing these lines by rotating my wrist. My wrist is used as a pivot to draw each arced stroke. Now here I'm drawing as if on beginner stage. Always start with a light layer and then go over the areas which have to be darker with a second layer. Now surfaces which are being hit by the light are never entirely white. Therefore I'm going over the area with a little bit of green, just a hint. Now let's go over it again and blend the light to the dark, so we'll have a smooth transition. Okay, now let's go over the areas which are supposed to be darker with another layer. And remember that while shading, you are to keep your strokes the same throughout the entire cylinder, the entire curved part of the cylinder. Now you might have noticed that I sped things up a little bit. However, remember that while shading, please take your time because we want a very neat and realistic final drawing. I'm going over these areas once more to have a smooth transition. Now onto our base. Same as we did on the other solid shapes, when drawing a flat surface, it's always ideal to keep your strokes going in one direction. Even when drawing back and forth, keep the strokes in one direction, however, back and forth. Now, when finished with the first layer, now since this is the darkest side, since it's the base, no light is hitting it, we're going to go over it with a second layer to make it darker. Now the last solid shape that we have is an image of two combined cylinders. Again, now on this shape we have two curved sides where our strokes are going to be curved and two flat surfaces. Here I'm going to draw that very light border line around the outlines of our shape to avoid from accidentally drawing outside the lines. Now I'm going to start by shading the top cylinder. I'm going to keep my strokes curved. And here I'm drawing as if though on beginner stage. I'm keeping my strokes very short and then I could always go over them later by blending the two areas together. And again, my first layer is going to be entirely light, very light. However, where I'm approaching the very light areas, where the light hits the shape the most, I'm keeping my strokes as light as possible, barely touching the paper. Now let's go over the lightest area. Remember, there is no such thing as a surface which turns entirely white when the light hits it. Remember to blend each area together so there would be a smooth transition from dark to light to dark again. Now I'm going over the dark areas with another second layer. Okay, now we're going to start shading our second cylinder by using the same method as before. Now let's shade the flat surfaces of our combined cylinders. Now remember, when shading flat surfaces, your strokes should be only in one direction, even when drawing back and forth. And that's the last solid shape that we have to shade in this lesson.